This is going to be an extremely busy month. I have to watch 104 soccer games, follow the pregame, the postgame, yell useless opinions at the TV. It's a lot. So I knew that when it comes to screening for colon cancer, the choice was clear. The Cologuard Plus test. It can be used at home and can only take 15 minutes, so I can do it during halftime and not miss any action. If you are 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about screening for colon cancer with the Cologuard test. You can also request a prescription at Cologuard.com.
He runs up and he grabs one of them, man. Like a guy that big can snap a woman's neck like a pencil stick. So I fucking ran up behind him with a hatchet. Smash, smash, smash.
Okay, so before we get into this, I need you to understand something about the internet. The internet is not a place. It's not a community. It's not even really a thing in the way we talk about it like it's a thing. The internet is more like a mood. A collective, slightly unhinged mood that occasionally decides someone is going to matter right now, today, forever, and then moves on to the next thing before the confetti even hits the floor. And in February of 2013, the internet decided that a bandana-wearing, hatchet-carrying, free-spirited nomadic hitchhiker named Kai was going to matter. Oh, did he ever matter? For about 6 weeks. And then everything went completely sideways.
You're listening to Unbound Off Script. No outlines, no safety nets. Just Beth Curry talking about whatever the hell she wants, or whatever the hell you've asked her to uncover. It's unfiltered, it's unpredictable, and it's officially started. Pull up a chair.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Unbound. This is an off-script episode, and today we're talking about Kai, the hatchet-wielding hitchhiker. And before any of you start scrolling through your memory banks going, wait, doesn't this story end badly? Yes. Yes, it does. We're going there because that's actually the point. But we're starting at the beginning because the beginning is genuinely one of the most unhinged, hilarious, stranger-than-fiction stories I have ever encountered. And I've spent a significant portion of my adult life elbow deep in true crime research. I do not say that lightly, so buckle up. This one's got everything. So, it's February 1st, 2013, a local Fox affiliate reporter named Jesse Reisbach is out in Fresno, California, covering the aftermath of a traffic accident involving a utility worker who'd been pinned between a car and a truck. Pretty standard stuff, I guess, as far as local news goes anyway. Tragic, yes. Newsworthy, sure. But not exactly the kind of story you expect to define your career. Until this dude met Kai. Kai, his full name we would later learn Caleb Lawrence McGilvray, was 24 years old at the time. Originally from Edmonton, Alberta, self-described home-free traveler, which, look, I appreciate the reframe, not homeless, home-free. There's actually something to that, philosophically speaking, but we'll come back to that later. He had long, wild hair, a bandana, a hatchet in his backpack, and an absolute, unshakable surfer dude energy that had absolutely no business being this coherent in the immediate aftermath of a violent roadside incident. Okay? Kai had been hitchhiking when he was picked up by a man named Jet Simmons McBride. And what follows is the kind of story that if you pitched it to a screenwriter, they would tell you it was too much. They would probably ask you to dial it back a little bit. So according to Kai, McBride, 6'4", around 300 pounds, picked him up and immediately began delivering what can only be described as a greatest hits of red flags. Okay? He claimed to be Jesus Christ. He told Kai he had raped a 14-year-old girl while on a business trip to the Virgin Islands. He expressed, let's say, violently racist views about Black people. And then when driving through Fresno in broad daylight, he intentionally drove his car into a Black utility worker, pinning the man between the bumper and a truck. When a woman named Tanya Baker ran over to help the injured worker, McBride emerged from the vehicle and grabbed her, and he began choking her. And that's when Kai reached into his bag and pulled out his hatchet. And in his now legendary words, smashed, smashed, smashed McBride's head repeatedly. McBride was subdued. The woman was okay. The utility worker survived. And the reporter, standing there with a camera, realized he was not covering the traffic accident he came out here for. He interviewed Kai. He uploaded the video that night, and he went to bed. And he woke up to 500,000 YouTube views. Now, here's where my forensic psychology brain does a little happy dance, because the reason this video went viral is actually really interesting if you look at it through a behavioral lens. Kai was not what people expected. That's the whole thing. Everything about the circumstances said this should be a traumatic, chaotic, confusing scene. A man just used a hatchet on another man's head in broad daylight in front of a TV camera. And Kai was chill. Like 420 by 420. Chill. He opened the interview by saying, and I'm paraphrasing here because I'm not going to quote it verbatim, but the gist was, no matter what you've done, you deserve respect. You're lovable, you're worthwhile, no one can take that from you. That was his preamp. Before explaining the hatchet situation, before any of the chaos, he wanted to make sure we all felt seen and valued first. I mean, what do you do with that? And then, this was the comedy gold right here, he launched into this absolutely wild story, delivered in a kind of rambling, enthusiastic, totally unself-conscious, Southern California beach city way that felt simultaneously like a surfer explaining a gnarly wave and a man genuinely processing something traumatic in real time. There was no performance. There was no awareness of how he looked. He was just Kai being Kai in full. Smash. The internet lost its mind. Within days, the Gregory brothers, the same people responsible for Bed Intruder and approximately 17,000 other auto-tuned viral moments, had turned Kai's interview into a song. It hit 11 million views. There were memes, there were remixes, there were think pieces, there were fan accounts. And suddenly Kai was everywhere. He got booked on Jimmy Kimmel Live. He was approached by Justin Bieber's team about a potential musical collaboration. Justin Bieber. A reality TV producer who had worked on Keeping Up with the Kardashians reached out about building a show around him. Like, Kai apparently signed that contract in the hieroglyphs or something, which is honestly ironically on brand. When he showed up for the Kimmel taping, he'd already gotten kicked out of the Roosevelt Hotel in Hollywood. This is a very fancy, very historic hotel. Beautiful. For drinking Jack Daniels, flashing a knife, skateboarding in the lobby. And before going on air, he peed on the sign in front of Kimmel's studio. These days, I can appreciate that. Anyway, he went on the show anyway. The host called him an unlikely hero, gave him a surfboard and a wetsuit, and gave him $500. How kind. Kai promptly gave the $500 to a security guard and apologized for pissing outside. I cannot, and I am not making this up. I'm going to take a detour here because getting into what I genuinely think is the most interesting part of the story, which is the phenomenon of it, right? The Kai as folk hero thing. Because it wasn't just that he was funny or quotable or memorable. It was that the internet had decided collectively that Kai was good. And that's a specific kind of thing. You know, it's not just viral. It's like mythology or something. And if you think about the archetypes we reach for when someone captures the internet's imagination, you know, the unexpected hero, the little guy who did something big, or the person who exists completely outside of social norms and somehow turns out to be more authentic and more decent and more human than the polished, curated version of humanity we usually see on our screens. Kai hit every single one of those notes. He was home free by choice, or at least that's the story he told. He shoplifted from stores and gave everything away to other unhoused people, like Robin Hood with a hatchet and a bandana. He had this long, wild hair and no ID and no social security card and no driver's license. He'd done a spirit walk on an indigenous reservation and came back with a new name. You know, he was, in the internet's eyes, completely untethered from the systems that constrain the rest of us. Deep respect. And then he used that freedom to save someone. There's a reason this resonated, particularly in 2013, when a significant chunk of the population was coming out of the economic crash, increasingly skeptical of institutions, increasingly exhausted by polished PR-managed, algorithm-optimized everything. Here was this guy who couldn't be optimized. He wasn't trying to be anything. He just was. The internet didn't just make Kai famous. The internet needed Kai to be exactly who they thought he was. And that need, that kind of collective emotional investment in a stranger's narrative, is something we don't look at deeply enough. Because what happens when the story doesn't hold? So, May 13th, 2013, barely 90 days after Kai went viral, A 73-year-old New Jersey attorney named Joseph Galfi was found beaten to death in his home in Clark, New Jersey. He was found in his underwear. The scene was, by all accounts, brutal. Investigators found at the scene a piece of paper with the words Lawrence Kai and a phone number. They Googled it. The results came back Kai, the hatchet-wielding hitchhiker. It must have been a truly surreal moment for whoever was sitting in the computer of the Clark Police Department. I don't know. A train ticket was also found at the scene, and that led investigators to pull surveillance footage from the station. And on the footage, Joseph Galfi apparently handing a ticket to someone who, from the back, looked very much like Kai. So the day after the murder, Kai had posted on Facebook. The post described waking up in a stranger's house with what he described as evidence that he had been drugged and sexually assaulted. He was found several days later at a bus station in Philadelphia. He had cut his hair. He confessed to killing Galfi, but maintained it was self-defense. Galfi had offered him a place to stay, and in the night he had drugged and raped him, and that he had acted in response to the assault. The police disagreed. They pointed to surveillance footage showing Kai and Galfi appearing friendly at the train station. They noted that Kai had reached back out to Galfi to ask if he could stay a second night. They noted that the crime scene showed no signs of defensive struggle, and they noted that Kai's account of events changed several times. They also, it should be said, and this is important, I'm going to be direct about it because it matters, denied Kai a rape kit. They washed the glasses that should have been tested for drugs. They allowed the victim's brother, who was a law enforcement officer, to be active at the crime scene. These are not small procedural hiccups, okay? These are significant failures that compromised the investigation in ways that made it impossible to fully evaluate Kai's account. I say that not to exonerate anyone. I say it because I've spent a long time in forensic spaces, and I know what sloppy investigation looks like, and I know the difference between evidence that's genuinely clear and evidence that's been rendered unknowable by the people who were supposed to protect its integrity. So what happened to Joseph Galfi was real. His death was real. The investigation that followed was not clean. Kai waited 6 years in jail before his case went to trial. He couldn't make bail, obviously. He represented himself for portions of it. He had outbursts. A judge called him, among other things, a powder keg of explosive rage. He called the trial a sham. He said he'd been railroaded. And in April of 2019, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder. In May of 2019, he was sentenced to 57 years. He will be eligible for parole around 2061. He'll be 73 years old, same age Galfi was when he died. The judge noted that out loud in the courtroom. He's currently incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. His 2021 appeal was denied. So I just want to stop here a sec before we get to the documentary, because I think this part of the story deserves more than a footnote, and historically it has gotten a footnote, a sentence, a polite acknowledgement before the narrative moves on. So I'm going to actually say it. Kai was not well, and everyone who came into contact with him during those 6 weeks of fame either knew it or had enough information to suspect it, and they proceeded anyway. And I want to be specific what not well means here, because I think we're sloppy with that phrase in ways that actually do a disservice to people who are genuinely struggling. I'm not saying Kai was incompetent or dangerous by default or incapable of insight. The man opened a news interview by saying that every human being deserves respect and love regardless of their history. That's not the output of someone who's lost their grip on reality, okay? That's someone who has been thinking hard, probably for a long time, about what it means to be discarded by the world and what people actually need to hear. But there's a difference between insight and stability, and Kai, by the accounts of people who were physically present with him, was not stable. The cameraman at the original interview clocked it immediately. He described a weird energy, an unpredictability that made him uneasy. The Kimmel producer described collecting a heavily intoxicated Kai who had been publicly urinating and flashing a knife at a hotel where he'd already been kicked out for skateboarding in the lobby after drinking most of a bottle of Jack Daniels. These weren't people who caught him on one bad night. This was the baseline. This was Kai functioning at the level he was capable of functioning at in February of 2013. So the question that I'm asking, if a friend called you and said, hey, I've got someone here They're drunk, they've been flashing a knife, they're unhoused, they have no ID, they were just in a violent roadside incident this morning and I need to get them ready for a television appearance. What would you do? I think most of us, if we're honest, would be on the phone to a crisis line or a hospital, or at minimum, we'd be saying, hey, let's pump the brakes, let's get this person some food, a safe place to sleep, and maybe talk to someone before we point a camera at them again. But what actually happened was they got him a ride to the studio, they put him on the air, Jimmy Kimmel called him an unlikely hero, and the audience cheered. I'm not going to share my personal opinions of Jimmy Kimmel and if he's a bad person or not. I'm also not saying the Kimmel team is a bad team. I'm saying that the entertainment industry has a very well-developed muscle for identifying what makes good television and a very underdeveloped muscle for asking whether the human being generating that television is okay. And those two muscles are almost never exercised at the same time because exercising the second one usually kills the first. This is not unique to Kai, not even close. If you think about the arc of Britney Spears in 2007, her shaved head, the umbrella, the very public unraveling, and the cameras that never not once stopped rolling. Or Amanda Bynes, whose mental health crisis played out in real time on Twitter, while the internet oscillated between concern and mockery, sometimes within the same thread. Think about the man who made the Leave Britney Alone video in 2007, Chris Crocker. He was 19 years old, visibly distressed, and he became a punchline for years before anyone thought to ask what was happening in his life that produced that moment. There is a pattern here. The pattern is visible distress plus charisma plus an audience equals content. And content is the only metric that seems to matter. What makes Kai's case particularly sharp is the speed of it. That just 6-week window from viral hero to arrested for murder. I think it's kind of brutal. It's clarity. There was no slow fade and no gradual distancing and no quiet withdrawal of support. Like one day he was on late night television getting a surfboard. 90 days later, he was in a New Jersey jail. And the same entertainment infrastructure that had been so eager to absorb him was suddenly unavailable for comment. I don't know. I think what the entertainment industry is genuinely not equipped to handle is the aftermath. The part where the person they elevated needs actual support, not a booking, not a brand deal, not a reality show contract signed in whatever, but actual support, therapy, housing, medication management if needed, a person who checks in not because there's a camera present, but because they give a damn. Kai had none of that. He had fans. He had memes. He had an auto-tuned song with 11 million views. And then he had a bus station in Philadelphia and a pair of handcuffs. I think about what might have been different if someone, anyone in those 6 weeks had just said this person needs help. Not as a judgment, not as a way of explaining away the heroism of what he did in Fresno, which was real, but as a simple human recognition that the guy in front of them was carrying more than a hatchet, right? He was carrying a history and a diagnosis that may or may not have ever been formally made, and a nervous system that had been operating in survival mode for a very long time. I don't know that different would have meant better. I don't know that intervention would have changed the outcome. Human beings are not equations, and I've been around long enough in these spaces to know that you can give someone every resource and every support and still not be able to stop what's coming. But I do know it would have been the right thing to do. And I know it didn't happen. And I think that matters. Not as a way of transferring responsibility away from Kai for his choices, but as an honest accounting of the conditions those choices were made in. The entertainment industry does not have a mental health problem. It has a prioritization problem. Mental health falls below content every time, until someone ends up in prison and then there's a documentary about it, a 48 hours episode, Dateline, whatever. We all shake our heads and we feel moved. And then the next person comes along who is clearly struggling and charismatic and quotable. And we do the whole damn thing again. Kai was not the first. He will not be the last. And the least we can do is name what we're watching when we watch it. Netflix. In January 2023, Netflix released The Hatchet-Wielding Hitchhiker, a documentary directed by Colette Camden, and it revisits the whole story, the viral video, the meteoric rise, the arrest, the trial, and it does something I think is genuinely valuable, which is that it looks squarely at the people who were around Kai during his 15 minutes and asks some uncomfortable questions about what they saw and what they chose to do about it. The cameraman who was present for the original interview described Kai as a loose cannon with an unsettling energy, and the researcher from Jimmy Kimmel Live recalled corralling a heavily intoxicated Kai, who'd been publicly pissing for television appearances. The reality TV producer showed up with a contract. Nobody hit pause. And I get it. I'm not throwing stones, but I am, because, I don't know, when it comes to Hollyweird, I'm pretty judgmental. I know that the pull of that kind of story is real. The pull of someone who seems like they exist outside of ordinary rules is intoxicating. Honestly, I do get it. It is the entertainment industry. But why are we exploiting people? We want to believe in people who don't need the things we've convinced ourselves are necessary, like the house and the ID and the social media strategy and the curated self, right? We want someone who just is. And when that someone also happens to be charismatic and quotable and genuinely entertaining to be around, the cognitive dissonance required to notice the warning signs kind of becomes easy to sustain, right? But the documentary makes the case. And it's a case that I think holds water, even if you complicate it, even if you leave room for ambiguity about what really happened in that New Jersey house. That what happened to Kai is at least partly a story about what the internet does to people who aren't equipped to survive its attention. Kai had no stable housing, he had no support system, no documentation, and by multiple accounts, real and untreated mental health struggles. He was handed a fire hose of fame and pointed at Hollywood, and nobody asked if he was okay. The machines of media and entertainment absorbed him and extracted what was useful. And then when things got complicated, when the story stopped being the story they signed up for, they moved on. And he was just kind of left there. And that's where it gets complicated for me, I think. I want to marinate in that for a second because I think it's important. I have forensic psychology background. I've spent a long time kind of looking at cold case stuff as an unpaid volunteer because I believe the importance of looking at evidence carefully, not letting narrative override fact, asking who benefits from a particular version of events. So when I look at the Kai case, I'm doing that thing where I can hold two things at once. Thing one, a man is dead. Joseph Golfi was 73 years old, an attorney, military vet. He was beaten to death in his own home. And that is real, and it's an irreversible tragedy. And thing two, the investigation into his death was compromised in several meaningful ways that made it impossible to fairly evaluate Kai's claim of self-defense. And Kai's claim that he was drugged and sexually assaulted was not disproven. It was simply not proven, in part because the people who were supposed to collect that evidence didn't. I'm not the jury. I wasn't there. I don't know what happened in that house. What I know is that we don't know is a different answer from he's lying. And those two answers lead to very different places, right? I also know that Kai's story from the beginning has never been simple. The background that emerged in follow-up reporting after the viral video, the fundamentalist Christian cult upbringing, the parental divorce, the childhood abuse he described, that transient lifestyle paints a picture of someone who had been surviving on the margins for a long time before anyone pointed a camera at him, right? And surviving on the margins without support and without resources, without anyone to call, that leaves marks. It leaves psychological marks, the kind that don't show up on toxicology reports, but completely shape how a person moves through crisis situations. So does any of that explain or excuse violence? No. It contextualizes it, right? Context is the thing that we constantly or consistently strip away when we're doing the internet hero, internet villain binary, because nuance doesn't travel well in meme form, does it, kids? The part I want to end on here, because I think it's the real reason I wanted to do this episode. There's a genre of internet moment that has its own name now, internet lore, the things we collectively remember and the shared cultural artifacts of the digital age. The stories that came at us, and they're so large and so strange that they almost feel mythological. Kai is, without question, a piece of internet lore. Internet lore has a grammar. It has a structure and it follows rules, even when it looks like chaos. There's always a protagonist who seems to come from nowhere, and there's always a moment of recognition. This person is special. This person is different. This person is one of us in some way we can't quite articulate. And then there's the acceleration and the memes and the remixes and the cameos and the merchandise and the documentary eventually. And then there's either the quiet fade or the dramatic fall. And what Kai's story reveals, if you're willing to look at it honestly, is that the grammar of internet lore is not equipped to handle actual human beings, because actual human beings are not protagonists. They don't have narrative arcs that wrap up cleanly. They don't exist to fulfill the story the audience has decided they're living. They have histories and they have struggles and bad nights and decisions that don't make sense and trauma that comes out sideways at 2 a.m. in ways that can't be edited into a shareable clip. We made Kai into a folk hero in 6 weeks. The internet decided collectively that he was like a hatchet-wielding Robin Hood and, this free-spirited wanderer with a moral compass uncorrupted by conventional society. We wanted him to be that. We needed him to be that. And because we needed it, we didn't look very hard at the warning signs that the people who actually spent time with him were clocking in real time. And that's not a Kai problem at all. It's an us problem. It's the same machinery that's chewed up and spit out dozens of people who went viral before and after him, too. The people who became memes before they had a chance to give consent. The people whose worst or most embarrassing or most frightening moments were broadcast to millions, attached to their legal names, searchable forever. The person who went viral for crying, or went viral for their audition, or they went viral for existing in public in a way that someone else found interesting. We talk about cancel culture a lot as a concept, as a concern. We talk about the dangers of the pile-on, the mob, the collective destruction of reputations, and that's real. But there's an equally damaging thing happening on the opposite end, which is the pile-on of adoration. The uncritical elevation of a stranger to folk hero status without their full picture, without their consent, without the infrastructure to support that kind of attention, and what it actually does to your human nervous system. Fame is a stressor, sudden, uncontrolled viral fame, especially for someone who's already living on the margins, like Kai was, someone who has no support network and has quite probably untreated mental health concerns. It's not a gift. It's an absolute crisis. And nobody sent Kai to therapy. They sent him to Jimmy Kimmel. I'm not going to sit here and tell you what to think about Kai McGilvery's guilt or innocence. I've laid out what I know. I've flagged where the evidence is murkier than the conviction suggests, and I've tried to hold the complexity of this story the way it deserves to be held, which is messily, without tidy resolution, because that's the honest version. But what I will tell you is this: the next time the internet decides someone's a hero, the next time a video goes viral and within 48 hours there's a GoFundMe and a song remix and a late night booking and a documentary deal in the works, I'd ask it to sit with a question for a moment before we click share. Who is this person when the camera's off? Not because this answer will always be dark. Sometimes people are exactly who they seem. Sometimes the viral moment really is just that. And the person goes back to their life and the whole thing dissolves like it never happened, blessedly. But sometimes the person the internet chose to love is a real human being carrying real history, standing in the middle of a real crisis, holding a hatchet. And I think the least we could do is look closely enough to see that. Thank you so much for being here for this one. You know how to find me if you have any questions, comments, anything like that. If you want to go deeper on the psychology of viral fame and what it actually does to the human brain and nervous system, message me. Could be our next conversation. This episode was actually a suggestion from someone, and they asked to remain anonymous. It wasn't Kai, I will tell you that. So yeah, till next time, take care of yourselves. Be thoughtful with the stories that you tell about strangers, and remember that home free is just another way to reframe away from unhoused, and how we name things matters more than we think, I think. I will see you next time.
You've been listening to Unbound, off script. The script remains missing. Authorities have been notified. Beth Curry is clocking out, turning off the lights, and pretending she didn't just say all of that out loud. If you want her to do it again on a different topic, let us know. Until next time, stay curious, stay raw, keep it unbound. She's gone.